my second tour in Vietnam, and they said, try to get civilian clothes and wear those on your way home because of the insults that we would receive. Now, 50 years later, here we are. And unashamedly, I can stand before you and say, I spent 2 tours in Vietnam. And so, and I look over and I saw all of our veterans stand, and I just want to thank you for all your service as well. Whether you served in a combat zone ducking bullets or fighting paper cuts, you served this country with honor and gave us the freedoms that we enjoy. And so I thank all of you for your service and the opportunity to share my story as a veteran as well. You know, we look at wars, and of course, immediately we know that war is hell. We've heard that before, and it's true. What a waste of young lives. And sometimes we look at the bad side, but I would like to share with you, in the midst of my story, a good side. Because out of Vietnam and my experience there came, in my worst day, the genesis of 2 of the greatest blessings in my life that literally transformed my life. My first tour in Vietnam, I flew scouts and special operations for MACSOG, studies and observation groups, and covert missions there. A number of times running over the fence into Cambodia. My second tour, I flew Cobra gunships in Vietnam, and those tours were all back-to-back because as a young and crazy youth, I constantly volunteered for some of the assignments that I ended up with. But in order for you to understand the transformation and how I can stand here today and say Vietnam was perhaps the best experience I could have ever experienced, you need to go back and know a little bit about me and my background in history. First and foremost, as I was growing up in a very unusual relationship and family, I grew up with 60 foster brothers and sisters. In addition to that, I have 2 blood sisters and 6 adopted brothers and sisters. Now, during that time, I learned how to be tough. You have to be in that kind of environment. And I've discovered that I'm a pretty good fighter, and that helped a great deal. It helped me in sports. I was in football, and looking at me, can you believe? I was a middle linebacker. And I had the honor of having more assist tackles than anybody else, and that was because most of the guys got their cleats caught in my chest when they ran over me. I was also a wrestler in high school and college. That helped pave my way into college. However, because of the rough side of me and the things that I was involved in, I got kicked out of my first college for getting in a bar fight and threw a bartender through a plate glass window. Back in the early 60s, that was kind of frowned upon in universities, and they asked me to leave. Leaving, I had to then go to work full-time and go to college full-time. During that time, of course, the Vietnam War was on, and things were getting kind of tight. I lost my 2S classification, and I knew that I needed to do something about my future militarily-wise. So I decided I wanted to fly for the Navy. And I went to the Navy recruiter and went through all the programs, passed all the tests for their Air Cadet program, but there was a waiting list of 6 to 9 months for the rotation to take place, and we went to my draft board, which was a country draft board who had a few country boys like me, and they would not give me a waiver. And they said in 90 days he's going to be in the Army. Well, immediately after leaving the draft board without that waiver, I walked right down to the Army recruiter and I enlisted. I was going to be darned if I was going to get drafted. But I discovered when I went into the Army, I went to basic at Fort Polk, Louisiana, and I discovered that the Army and I really clicked together. I became the outstanding basic trainee of the company, and then of the cycle of 1,250 men. And because I was number 1, they came to me and said, "What would you like to do?" Well, I said, I have always wanted to be an officer and I wanted to fly. And they said, your best bet is to go to Warrant Officer Flight School. And so that's where I went. Warrant Officer Candidate School and Flight School. Graduating, I went to primary flight school at Fort Walters, Texas, and then on to Hunter Army Airfield in Savannah, Georgia. Instead of Rucker, those who were going to go into guns or medevacs, for the most part, went to Hunter Army Airfield. Well, during that time, being young and foolish, I volunteered for Vietnam because there was a chance I could have to be going to Korea. And growing up in Michigan in the cold weather, I heard that the winters were really bad in Korea, and I did not want to go there. So I'll go to Vietnam. I figured if I get there anyhow. Well, in the process, they give you all these kind of intellectual profiles and so forth, and they discovered that something wasn't quite right in my mind. So when I got to Vietnam, they said, well, you don't want to fly this. What you need to do is you need to get trained in the OH-6 Alpha. Now, if you've watched Magnum PI, that helicopter there, that's an OH-6 Alpha. Normally, it's strapped in the military configuration with a gun, machine gun on the side. We carry some frag grenades and have all kinds of fun. And the missions there are normally hazardous, whether you're supporting a division or you're a scout. I volunteered. I thought that was great. They never told me that the highest mortality rate for helicopter pilots was in OH-6 Alphas. So away I went, and I did very well. It seemed like the more contacts I got into, the more firefights I got involved in, the more shoot-em-ups I did, the more medals they put on my chest. So by this time, I had already had one of my Distinguished Flying Crosses, 2 of my Bronze Stars with Valor, a number of air medals with Valor, and I thought I was super warrior. Well, I had all those medals. But also, I discovered I was having some problems. You see, I went through one of the units where I and another guy were the only ones who survived either death or wounded of those who began. Another unit, I was the only one. And by that time, whenever we had to stand down, and I got away from the combat, which was not often, I had problems with disassociation. I could share with one another, and we could laugh, and the next minute that person could be wounded or killed, and I didn't feel anything. Except to the point that I was drinking a fifth of Southern Comfort every night when we had stand-downs to deaden it all. Superhero. And then August 28th, 1969 happened. The worst day of my life in Vietnam, and yet the genesis of the best of my life. That morning, after briefing, climbed into my OH-6 Alpha with 2 intelligence individuals, one a captain, intelligence officer. We were going to do a recon mission with no cover, trying to fool the enemy in an area, AO, operational area, in the southern part of what is called the Iron Triangle. We knew there was a large enemy base camp there, and my job was to help scout that out before we plotted a military action against that base camp. Well, they weren't all that surprised. As I flew in at 7 o'clock in the morning in that AO, 3 machine guns opened up. And in the first rounds that hit the aircraft, I received 2 machine gun rounds going up through the buttocks, and one into the back and one in the spine. This leg was partially paralyzed. Immediately, it was second growth of brome plow, which means the trees were about as high as the ceiling here. It had been knocked down and the jungle had grown up again. And in the midst of that, we went right down in the middle of that NBA base camp with no cover. I was severely wounded. An intelligence officer in my back seat took one across the side of the head, one through the hand, and was unconscious. We crashed, rolled on the side. They continued to shoot up the aircraft. I watched my instrument panel and the rest fly by. I pulled off whatever I could, grabbed my weapons, and tried to crawl out of the aircraft, finally getting out, knowing that I was going to die. And so were the rest. You don't go down in the middle of an NBA base camp with the cover to come out alive. I had barely gotten out of the aircraft when the couple came up to try to finish me off. Unfortunately, I got them first, which caused the enemy to have a little bit of respect. As I started to crawl away from the aircraft, I looked back, and the intelligence officer, the aircraft was burning by this time, was trapped underneath the aircraft. I went back and pulled him out, and we began crawling, and I pushed him along the way. We regrouped in a small little area, continued to take fire. In fact, it's one of those times my zipper kept me too high off the ground. And I knew I was going to die. There wasn't any question. I don't remember at that point being overwhelmed with fear of dying. I'd faced it so many times, the original panic was gone. But now I felt a sense of overwhelming despair. Here I had lived for myself, and now I was going to die, and nobody was going to care. In the 2 tours I had in Vietnam, I was not close to my own family. I left home basically at 18, and I can count in both hands the number of letters I've got from my immediate family. Oh yeah, they would cry, but they would soon get over it. In the military, soldiers die. My life didn't feel like it had much meaning. And then I felt cheated. Here I was super warrior, and I thought I could control my destiny, and I realized in that moment that if you can't control your death, folks, you can't control your destiny. And then the most wonderful thing happened in my life. All those things that people tried to tell me about God loving me and had a purpose and plan for my life, things that I ridiculed and laughed at because I thought anybody who believed that kind of stuff had to be a wimp and a weirdo. Made sense to me. Made sense. I can't explain it all. I don't know why. But all of a sudden, all of those things that people had tried to tell me that God had a better plan for your life made sense to me. And in that moment, there came a peace. Now, I'd always been a battler. I'd always been a fighter, and I knew I was going to die, but I wasn't going to go easy. And I was going to fight for everything that I could. Now, folks, listen to me. It was sort of like a busy day. You know, you got so many activities that you're trying to do everything you can to stay awake. But if you should go to sleep, it would be okay because you're so tired. Well, that was life and death. I'm going to do everything I can to stay alive, but if I die now, it's okay. Well, obviously, some miracles took place. Approximately 7 minutes after we were on the ground, 2 Cobra gunships that had been on a river patrol happened to go through our battalion area that I was working in and heard my Mayday, Mayday, and got vectored from there to where I had gone down. They left that river patrol. It just so happens that they were there, right? But they could see me and they could see the enemy and they could see us kind of shooting back and forth, aggravating each other. And because we were so close, they couldn't put suppressive fire, but they would come right down on top of the treetops and pull off and draw fire away so that we could begin to push our way out like an egg. Over the next 45 minutes, I crawled and pulled that officer over 65 yards to a small clearing that I knew, if possible, they could medevac us out. Finally, some brave medevac, who was not a regular medevac, who was one who took people from one hospital to another, said, "We'll go in and get them." And so they did. They threw us into the helicopter, and one medic who was very big and very strong, see, I had gone up and tried to get the other guys in and went back a ways, crawling to cover our rear with my Thompson submachine gun. And I thought, when they finally, it's my turn to get on the aircraft, I'd just make a leap or two and I'd get there. I forgot this leg wasn't working. And I went flat on my face, and this big medic grabbed a hold of me and literally threw me into the open bay of that helicopter. Off we went, ping, 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 taking a bunch of rounds, and I thought, oh boy, we're going to go down again. But it was just like match. They took me to Coochie. One of my brothers over here, he got shot up, and that's where he ended up, in the hospital in Coochie. So we have something common there. I went to Coochie, and I can remember they were trying to keep me awake. You know, you lost a lot of blood, and they were afraid I was going into shock, and so they were asking me all kinds of dumb questions, like what were the coordinates you got shot down in? Like, you're going to care. You know, take care of me. After 9 days of intensive care and their fear that I was going to lose spinal fluid, they sent me to Saigon, and from there they were going to send me to Japan and home, and I did not want to go home. And I pled with them, please, can't you take the bullet out of the spine? And they said, we can send you to Vung that has a special surgical unit there and see what we can do. And I said, oh, please do that. And sure enough, they were able to get the bullet out of the spine. I regained use of my right leg, which was great because they told me in the hospital at first I would never fly again and probably never walk. Now I want you to know, not only did I walk, but I got shot down 5 more times. Didn't get any smarter. Now, the first blessing of my worst day was I realized that God had something better. What about that second blessing? Well, I met a young lady when I was an advisor from the bank that I was working at while I was going to college, who was part of junior achievement. She was a student, and I was the advisor. So we couldn't date until after that was over, and she was right pretty. And so we dated for a couple of months, and I went into the Army, and she said, Dear John. We saw each other just briefly before I went to Vietnam, but her mother and my mother kept in contact because her mother said she always loved me first. Now listen, folks. She found out that I got shot up, and I was bouncing around the hospitals. And she felt sorry for me. So she started writing. Now I was smart enough back then to realize that if I was ever going to have smart, good-looking kids, I'd have to marry a smart, good-looking woman who was weak for a moment and take advantage of her. She was a beauty queen, cheerleader in high school and college, and a straight-A student in both high school and college. Yes! So I took advantage. In between my first tour, I volunteered after I got out of the hospital, go right back, finish a tour. And then as I was closing out that tour, I volunteered to go right back if I could fly Cobras instead of getting shot up in scout aircraft. During that time coming home, we hadn't seen each other for over a year and a half, hadn't dated for over 2.5 years. 15 minutes after I saw her at her college, I proposed and said, when are we going to get married? She did the same thing you did, laughed. But I took advantage. You know, she was still sympathetic. And I was still limping. And in my uniform. If she had said no, it would have been against God, country, mom, and apple pie. 2.5 hours later, she said yes. We saw each other for about 5 days, where she went on to mission trips in California, then I went back to Vietnam, and our courtship was in the mail. 5 days after I got home the second time, we were married. They said it would never last, and coming up in December, it will be 49 years. And so I'm going to ask my second blessing if she would stand. Those 2 blessings transformed my life. Now, it took some time and it took some effort. Because of the things that we experience, we don't change overnight. But I'm here to tell you that I wouldn't trade my experience in Vietnam for anything. Not only am I honored to serve this country, and I believed in what we were doing, but even more, my worst day became the genesis for my best days that have gone on ever since that time. And you don't have to be in Vietnam or in combat for you to experience that as well. For the lesson I learned was this: your worst days can be the beginning of your best days. One of the things that I have walked with ever since that time is something that I found in the Bible, and that's in Joshua 1:9. And it says these words: have I not commanded you? Be strong and courageous. Do not be frightened and do not be dismayed. For the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. I'm a living testimony of that. And I thank God for the transformation. And I thank God for all of you, and all of you veterans. I honor you. Thank you for your service. God bless each and every one of you, and God bless the USA.